And I think what we're doing, it's the same as, virtually the same as putting fentanyl on a shelf within reach of kids. Having plants in the homes is just as wacky, it's just as unacceptable.
Bill C-45 is the Canadian Liberal Party's Cannabis Legalization Act, with cannabis set to be legalized next year. Now, you think with Canada moving towards legalization that we would be past the reefer madness propaganda part of marijuana. But we're not. So this is Peter Kent, Conservative MP for Thornhill. Now, despite his time in the House of Commons, he's still best known for his work as the anchor for First National on Global News. Okay, now, even though I'm about to debunk Peter Kent's fear-mongering on cannabis legalization, it's worth noting that Kent has been known for good journalistic work. On January 24th, 1984, the CBC television program The Journal broadcast a full-edition documentary called The Greenhouse Gas Effect and Planet Earth, hosted, narrated, and written by Kent. Broadcast more than 27 years ago, this may be one of the first major media reports on the subject. Kent concluded with these words: "The greenhouse effect must be considered as the world's greatest environmental concern." Now, I'm showing you this up front because I don't have anything against Peter Kent personally, but the stuff that he said during a debate on cannabis legalization is just plainly wrong, and it needs to be debunked. So I'm going to show you 6 different clips here, and get ready, because this is some grade A reefer madness stuff. Now, let's get to the first clip, which is about how the Liberals trotted out their legalization plans on cannabis.
This was not, Mr. Speaker, a celebratory unveiling of new legislation. It looked like middle school detention time. There was not a smile among the group. The Marijuana Five sat grimly during the almost hour-long news conference, and not one of the ministers, Mr. Speaker, spoke the word marijuana.
Wow.
They contorted themselves and their talking points into more coils than a hookah pipe, talking about their concerns of vulnerable kids, of the risks and dangers of the product that they were about to make recreational, of attempting to engage in a price war with organized crime, and repeatedly emphasizing they weren't actually advocating marijuana consumption. As I said, Mr. Speaker, not one of the Marijuana Five managed to actually speak the word. Instead, they stuck to Latin, cannabis.
Okay, so I have a couple things to address in this clip. So first up, Peter Kent says, quote, "This was not a celebratory unveiling of new legislation. It looked like middle school detention time." Now, Peter Kent and myself may disagree on why the Liberal Party is treating cannabis legalization this way, but I completely agree with them. Right now, the Liberal Party is treating their Cannabis Legalization Act as if they're about to unleash a disease on the country, whereas they really should be treating it as celebratory. We are finally getting rid of an aspect of the war on drugs, which has proved to be a complete failure. So I'm not sure why the Liberal Party keeps focusing on all the potential negatives of legalization instead of also at least equally discussing all of the benefits of legalization. And it leads to things like this, where Peter Kent and the Conservative Party make it appear that, yeah, cannabis legalization is going to be a terrible thing. Just listen to how the Liberals talk about it. But if the Liberals were actually, adding some positivity to the discussion, then there might not be as much fear-mongering around legalization. Now, the other part of this clip I want to address is his use of marijuana versus cannabis. So, Peter Kent appears to be alluding to the fact that because the Liberal Party aren't using the word marijuana and they're using the word cannabis instead, that somehow is trying to make it sound, I don't know, less dangerous or something. But here's the thing. Peter Kent doesn't understand the history of the word marijuana and why pot activists or cannabis activists are using the word cannabis now and not using the word marijuana. So let me try and help you understand a bit of the reasons behind that. The term marijuana is linked to the Reefer Madness campaign of the 1930s, used to demonize cannabis by associating it with Mexican immigrants. The word marijuana has Mexican Spanish roots. It wasn't commonly used in the US until the 1920s and 1930s, when states began to pass laws against the cannabis plant. At the time, there was a growing wave of sentiment against Mexican immigrants entering the country. The immigrants brought pot smoking with them. The Great Depression had just hit the United States, and Americans were searching for someone to blame. Due to the influx of immigrants, especially in the South, and the rise of suggestive jazz music, many white Americans began to treat cannabis and arguably the blacks and Mexican immigrants who consumed it as a foreign substance used to corrupt the minds and bodies of low-class individuals. It would not be an overstatement to say that Harry Anslinger, the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was one of the primary individuals responsible for creating the stigma surrounding cannabis. Anslinger articulated, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effects on the degenerate races." When making public appearances and crafting propaganda films such as Reefer Madness, Anslinger specifically used the term marijuana, adding to the development of the herb's new foreign identity. So you can see that the reason we try not to use the word marijuana is because that term was specifically used as a fear-mongering tactic against Mexican immigrants and black people, which is why the word cannabis is better. Now let's go on to the next clip.
Now, the Health Committee also heard in evidence from the United States that where Colorado in its legalization allows homegrown marijuana, Washington State does not, an exception being for frail medical consumers. The rather stark results: in Washington State, where no homegrown was allowed, organized crime's share of the marijuana market was reduced to less than 20% in less than 3 years. In Colorado, where homegrown was allowed, organized crime jumped into the game and continues to flourish.
Okay, there's a lot to address here, so let's get into it. Now, the Colorado House did okay efforts to limit marijuana grows in homes, citing organized crime as the reason. But while Canada will allow 4 plants per home, this is what Peter Kent is not telling you about Colorado. In a bid to crack down on drug trafficking, the Colorado House on Monday voted to put new limits on homegrown marijuana that would dramatically reduce the number of plants people can legally grow in residential areas. The bill would impose a blanket 16 plant per home limit, whether the pot's grown for medical or recreational purposes. That represents a significant reduction from the current cap, which goes as high as 99 plants for medical marijuana patients and caregivers, a limit that law enforcement officials say has been exploited by large-scale international crime organizations. So while Canada only allows 4 plants per home, Colorado at one point allowed 99 plants per home, and they reduced it to 16. Now, that may be the reason, the 99 plants, that there was an uptick in organized crime. But lowering it to 16 plants is still 4 times what Canada has. So if Colorado now sees 16 plants as the safe number of plants to allow in a home, Canada is way under that with 4 plants. So there really is no fear of organized crime around 4 plants per home. And now this article in the Star goes into why the illegal pot business in general is failing. Once a relatively safe, profitable business for outlaw bikers and mobsters, organized crime is moving away from the marijuana market because legalization and homegrown pot are making any gain not worth the risk, experts say. A pretty small part of the marijuana industry today is what I call organized crime, said criminologist Neil Boyd of Simon Fraser University, a change from a few decades ago, when big league criminals thrived in the pot trade. The efforts of organized crime to control the pot trade have been undermined for the past 3 decades by disorganized crime, according to Alan Young, an associate professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School. Many of these are green thumb potheads, growing marijuana for friends. Others are in it for the money, but don't resort to traditional organized crime hallmarks of corruption, collusion, and violence. They're really just business people, Boyd says. So no, there is no fear of an uptick in organized crime because of 4 plants per home. The people that are selling it right now are largely just business people who aren't paying taxes. Now, on to the next clip.
And coming back to testimony from south of the border, we've also learned from Colorado there's been a 32% increase in drug-impaired driving.
So I tried to find the source where Peter Kent got the 32% uptick in drug-impaired driving, and all I could find was this article from the Canadian Press. which cites a document prepared for the Justice Minister last year that says the number of marijuana-related traffic deaths spiked 32% in Colorado, the first year after cannabis was legalized. Yet, other reports said differently. From The Independent, road fatalities in Colorado have plummeted since marijuana was legalized. And from the Washington Post, since marijuana legalization, highway fatalities in Colorado are at near historic lows. Now, to be fair to Peter Kent, there is an article in the Denver Post that says traffic fatalities linked to marijuana are up sharply in Colorado. Is legalization to blame? But that article clearly states, Colorado transportation and public safety officials say the rising number of pot-related traffic fatalities cannot be definitively linked to legalized marijuana. Positive test results reflected in the NHTSA data do not indicate whether a driver was high at the time of the crash, since traces of marijuana use from weeks earlier also can appear as a positive result. So when somebody tests positive for THC in their system, it doesn't actually mean they were impaired behind the wheel, because THC stays in the system longer than alcohol. Now, let's get to the next clip, where Peter Kent and myself may actually agree on something.
Now, the Liberals claim, Mr. Speaker, that they will squeeze organized crime out of the marijuana market through predatory pricing, undercutting street prices. The Liberal government of Ontario is talking about a $10 a gram price, of course with sales tax on top. And this Liberal government is talking about another tax, $1 a gram federal levy. The street dealers, the distributors for organized crime, are laughing out loud, Mr. Speaker, at prices in the $8 to $12 a gram range will actually put them out of business. On radio talk shows in Toronto the last couple of weeks, it was clear that both sellers and buyers of the market today believe the illicit market will continue to exist and quite possibly grow.
Now, apart from the point on organized crime, which I already debunked, I do agree with Peter Kent on the taxes. I think cannabis is going to be taxed at a much higher rate than necessary, and that does leave an opening for the black market to thrive. Now, let's get to the next clip.
This Liberal majority, rushing through using the guillotine legislative tool today to cut short debate, is going to pass Bill C-45. They are determined to force it on Canadians, on Canadian communities, on Canadian police forces, on Canadian society, and they're doing it far too soon. They talk about, oh, we're not rushing, we've had exhaustive consultation. They're not listening to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. No.
So Peter Kent says that cannabis legalization is being rushed through and that Liberals aren't listening to Canadians. Well, here are the facts. Canadians do approve of Liberals' marijuana legalization, but with some reservations. The survey conducted by the Angus Reid Institute shortly after the government tabled its marijuana legalization found that 63% of respondents were strongly or moderately in favor of the Liberals' plan. Just 37% were opposed. A majority of Canadians of every age were in favor of the legislation, though support was strongest among those 18 to 34 at 72%. The poll also found that 58% of Canadians polled thought that marijuana legalization would do more good than harm, whereas 42% felt that it would do more harm than good. So despite what Peter Kent is saying, Canadians are in fact ready for cannabis legalization, and the majority of them even agree with the Liberals' legislation on it. Now, do we all agree on the specifics? No, obviously not. There's going to be varying opinions on how exactly it should be rolled out. But that's what this process is for, and it's not going to be perfect until it's legalized and out for a few years, and we see what works and what doesn't. That's just all part of the process. Now, let's go to the next clip.
And there is that contradiction between the capability of a home grow with 4 plants producing up to 600 grams of marijuana product when the legal possession limit is 30. Now, the government says, oh, well, we'll prosecute anybody that's selling that or giving it away to children. But the fact that these plants are going to be into the home, kids today will learn from one another. When it's legal, despite the age, the allowable age to consume, kids are going to harvest leaves, kids are going to experiment, and I think what we're doing, it's the same as, virtually the same as putting fentanyl on a shelf within reach of kids. Having plants in the homes is just as wacky, it's just as unacceptable, it's just as dangerous for Canadian society.
Okay, so right off the bat, let's address the fentanyl comment, which is obviously ridiculous. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine, and opioid-related deaths have exploded in Canada. Marijuana, on the other hand, makes you feel funny. And even Peter Kent himself walked back those comments on Twitter, while also seemingly giving away his personal email address by mistake. Now, one of the other things that I want to address in that clip that Peter Kent brought up a few times during his speech was, how can the Liberal Party approve of 30 grams of possession, but allow 4 plants in the home where you can grow more than 30 grams of cannabis? Well, here's the difference. 30 grams is allowed for possession in public. You can have 30 grams on you in public. So that's different than having 4 plants in your home. It's pretty easy to understand. But when you have Peter Kent twisting the facts and making you think, yeah, why are we allowed 30 grams, but you can grow more in your home? It's because 30 grams is just what you can have on you in public. It's that simple. So there you go. Now, another aspect of this that I do think is important is just getting back to the question around fentanyl and how ridiculous it is to compare fentanyl to cannabis when more people have died from drinking water than from cannabis use. And more kids have died from choking on Lego than from cannabis use. Not to mention people have their prescription drugs and even just Tylenol lying around their homes, which is more dangerous to children. Now, despite getting slammed in the media for his ridiculous comments around cannabis legalization, Peter Kent has continued the debate on Twitter, tweeting out a link where, quote, Colorado doctors claim first marijuana overdose death. Yet he refuses to post the update to that story, which says, quote, we are absolutely not saying that marijuana killed that child, end quote. And that's from Thomas Napie, a doctor and the author of the original report. And other tweets you won't see from Peter Kent is how weed is helping opioid users beat addiction, or how after legalization, teen marijuana use dropped sharply in Colorado. But no, Peter Kent prefers to fearmonger, while dismantling his legacy as a once well-respected newscaster.